No Film School's coverage of NAB is brought to you by My Road Reel. The world's largest short film competition is back. Shutterstock, your source for stunning HD and 4K footage, plus high-quality music. Blackmagic Design, amazing solutions for film, post-production, and television.
Hey, I'm Ryan with No Film School. We are here with Lytro, whose presentation at NAB 2016 was standing room only. It is a light field photography, motion picture camera, could potentially change cinematography as we know it. So we're here with John, the head of light field video. I don't even know if you call it video at this point. We're going to find out the scoop on this, get a demo, and go through this 755 megapixel cinema camera. John, thanks for being with us.
Oh, thank you. Really appreciate your time. So why don't we just go ahead and start off with what it means to capture with a light field. The way that we always think of a light field is that in traditional photography, you're capturing the color and the intensity of light on one flat imaging surface. With a light field, you're actually capturing the discrete angular information, or those actual rays of light. So what we're showing here is actually content that comes off of the camera, where you're now able to take those rays of light and project them into space, because you can effectively ray trace the light back into the real world. The easiest way to think of what you get with a light field camera or with Lytro Cinema is that it is a digital holographic representation of everything that's in front of the camera. With light field, you're actually taking the raw discrete rays of light. So optically, it's as if you have the ability to change these decisions as part of the software process. And it's optically perfect in terms of those changes. So it's not a simulation, it's not a depth effect, it's actually ray tracing every ray into space, like you had a CG render and you're actually using some kind of a ray tracing methodology. So this is the actual Lytro Cinema technology. This is what we showed on Tuesday. It is the highest resolution video sensor ever designed. And if you know of one that's higher, please let me know. In the technology, we have the micro lens architecture that gives you quite literally millions of lenses to do this holographic imaging. The camera is capable of capturing up to 300 frames per second. It also is able to achieve 16 stops of dynamic range. So we like to really highlight that the architecture allows you to gain all of these additional benefits in addition to providing exactly what you would expect for industry standard image quality.
How do you even think about sensor size? Obviously, that's a traditional thing where people think about Super 35 and
right.
What's the Lytro approach there?
So we are a Super 35. It is a very non-standard optical format. The first generation of the technology, the image sensor is quite literally larger than 1/2 meter wide. So we have very different optics, we have very different methodologies in order to collect that much light. But you have the real world points. They go through a main lens, and that is the lens that you'll see in front of the actual Lytro Cinema camera. And then behind that, we actually have millions of micro lenses. So with those millions of micro lenses, you're actually taking the light that would have been previously focused at that imaging surface, and you're breaking them into those core angular components. So now you have in-focus rays that project back out into the real world, and that allows you to, with the computational backend, reprocess all the information back into basically where the original 2D image would have been focused. So that's the easiest way to think about a light field, if that's easy in any way.
No, it's not.
No, okay.
But I guess one of the first questions that I would have from a technical standpoint, how much are you able to differentiate the camera and move the camera in this space? Because you're still just getting, no matter how many millions of micro lenses you have, there's still a perspective from which you've chosen to put the camera, right?
Absolutely correct. So actually, if you look at the lens in this diagram, the main lens at the front, the left to right or the top to bottom distance actually defines the parallax that you can generate. So you have now, that's called the entrance pupil of the lens. The entrance pupil in this Cinem system is approximately 100 millimeters. So you have a true optical shift capability of a full 100 millimeters. So the Lytro Cinema technology is all about the frustum, or the actual field of view from the camera. It's not about the VR type immersive experience like the other technologies. It's all about taking that density of resolution and giving the filmmakers the image quality that's required in order to produce a cinema level film.
Which is an important distinction because It's still the intent of the director and the cinematographer and where they place the camera.
Exactly.
You're still there. There are adjustments, but it's not like the studio could come in later and say, oh, you know what, for this shot we want to be on the other side of the room because we wanted to see someone's backside or something. It's still your creative intent.
That's correct, unless of course you shoot with two of these.
That would be true of traditional
Of any
2D cameras as well.
So you can get the impossible shot, the things that you can do. They're fundamentally just not possible with traditional optics. And on the film Life that was directed by Robert Stromberg and cinematographer David Stump, what we're able to do is literally bring them into the actual editorial suite and go through shot by shot within the actual EDL and make creative changes. So we're able to provide them on set with a real-time QuickTime ProRes file or an MXF file, depending on what the workflow actually is. And that goes immediately over to the editorial department. They make creative decisions based upon the actual cuts of what's going into the film. We sync the EDL directly into Nuke Studio, and then we can actually manipulate the light field directly. So we're going to go ahead and actually launch this. So when you look at this, we actually have all of the metadata embedded here into the tool. When we create the file, it's actually an EXR file, so it's kind of a standard open source file format. And then as you look through all of the tabs here, you actually have all of the metadata that was captured on set embedded directly into the file. So you can't lose the logs. It's a direct, it's the physical focal length, it's a physical, everything about the captured scene is now embedded directly into the metadata, and that's required for light field projection. And that's why all that information is exposed here for you. So here what you're looking at is the ability to modify the light field. You have your little focal point. Let's say I want to change my depth of field. I can then apply that. So now you can see you have shallow depth of field where the ball is in focus and the boy falls out of focus. I can then also move my focal point anywhere arbitrarily in the scene. And you can see here that your aperture updates, you have your focus distance, that is an exact measurement in real world coordinates for where everything is within your actual field of view. Right now you have the equivalent aperture of an f1.1 lens, but then we can go well above and beyond that because again we have an exact understanding of where that point is in space. So let's say for example, I want to create an f.5 lens, or I want to create an f.3 aperture lens, or 0.2, or keep going until, if you see here, we're going a little crazy, where you have a depth of field that is so shallow that literally it's within less than a millimeter of actual focus.
Like for a physical lens, we would basically consider this to be impossible.
That is 100% impossible. Yeah. So the ability to do this is actually liberating from a cinematography standpoint because you're able to do things that previously were optically impossible, and from a focus standpoint, you couldn't focus this shot with any human because the depth of field is so shallow. Any subtle movement would require just some kind of a machine precision to do it.
Right. There's no filter or tilt shift lens or anything that would let you do that actual thing.
That's correct. That's correct. Now, we also can do tilt shift. We can do anything that you want. You can move your sensor virtually in any coordinate, any direction. All those tools are right here, so you can see tilt and shift and everything that you would like. So this is basically the general interface. This is the engineering design. As we get into the commercial release, it'll look a little prettier, a little more easy to use. The other thing that we're able to do here is stereoscopic creation, and it's true stereo 3D native capture. So it's very important to distinguish it from any 2D 3D conversion or from some kind of a beam splitter rig that is one lens, one sensor. But because we can move the camera dynamically in space, you have exacting control from 0 interaxial all the way through 100 full millimeters of separation.
And our eyes are physically less than 100 millimeters apart.
That's correct. In traditional cinema production, they're anywhere between 20 to 40 millimeters. But what you can do here is quite literally, I can just click a little button here. I can set one camera to this position. I can set another camera to the opposite side. You're now seeing the equivalent of a 48 millimeter interaxial separation. This is 100% accurate to as if I had made this exact decision at the time of capture. But now you have the ability to animate these parameters. You have the ability to generate any stereo shape, any stereo volume that you would want. So the depth screen is something that gives you the capability of virtualizing your entire world without actually having to do very complex green screens. And green screens are great. They let you do compositing and virtualize that set, but obviously the setup time and the lighting is very challenging. So what you can do with the actual depth screen is just by virtue of capturing with the light field, you can extract out the backgrounds. So this is the final composite, and clearly this is not supposed to look photoreal. This is just a matte painting that Robert, the director of the film, hand painted, and it fits within the storyline of the actual content itself. And then what you do here is, if you see, this is actually quite literally shot in the parking lot of the soundstage. We literally took the camera outside, we aimed it right in the parking lot. We were then allowed to have the actors perform in this environment without being restricted by the green screen. It was giving Robert, the director, much easier ability to have them interact with that space. So with this, traditionally, this is a very complex key. If you note all the hair and all that detail, and how would you actually extract this out without the green screen? What we can do is perform the depth extraction process. So here you're seeing this is the depth estimation, and from that point you do a rough estimation, and from there you actually perform, basically you calculate how all those rays of light are going through the light field, and you can extract out the background and the foreground separately. So this is how you're able to perform the final composite. So you can see that I can easily dynamically scrub through the volume. And the volume here, what you're trying to do is just create that slice in space. It's giving the algorithm a very rough estimation of where it is pulling the actual rays of light from. So once you do that, you can also make a different decision if you want to have the girl removed from the foreground, and it's really just that quick here. And then once you get to this place, then you calculate the final alpha estimation, which looks something like this. So now you have all that fine detail, all the fish netting from the hat, and it is basically just this refinement process that allows you to do this extraction. But now I have literally millions of rays of light to assess that gives you not only the depth information, but the color, the intensity, and everything else about the light field. So it is looking at the volume. The volume is what dictates how to extract out this very rich and dense information.
You've basically created, like if someone were to think about Photoshop layers, you're giving the ability to turn one on or off. And there are more layers than just the subject and the green screen, but everything in between, you could set a range.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So from that point, then you can go into your final composite. You now have the virtual world here, where you have the basically the foreground couple with the virtual matte painting in the background. And you can do the same thing by refocusing it just like you would do if it was a live action play. But you can see here that it is defocused, and then I can actually defocus them and have the matte painting in focus. This is, again, in that proxy mode. Then you would do the full ray trace render, and all your edges and everything would look perfect and sharp and beautiful. One of the most important of these parameters is the ability to control your frame rate and your shutter angle. So in traditional photography, you make certain decisions based upon that, the fundamental rules of the exposure triangle. Those rules kind of start to go away. I'm sorry. What we are able to do now is you can control all of that through something that we call a volumetric flow vector. So we generate that as almost like a fluid simulation of how the light rays not only go through the lens, but how they travel over time. We have a very exacting understanding of how all of that is accomplished, which gives us full control over those variable shutters. So you can use that for distribution. So again, you can release, let's say, at 24 frames per second with the correct shutter angle or motion blur for that scene, or for high frame rate for broadcast or anything in between, or you can use it creatively. So on this particular sequence, as I play it back here, you see this is the original shot. You see it was shot on this not very attractive and not very useful JCPenney looking photo backdrop. And there are practical lights flashing and doing horrible, horrible things that if you were trying to do any keys, just fundamentally don't work. And we do the depth extraction. So you can see here the rough key that goes into the final actual extraction, or basically the depth screen of that element. And then from here, we integrate all the matte paintings, all the CG elements. They're converted into 4D light fields to perform the final refocus. And then we can control the motion blur independently. We can also go beyond the actual capabilities of the sensor. Right now, you're seeing the equivalent right there of a 1440 degree shutter angle.
And since we're looking at soldiers here, basically, if Steven Spielberg decided after the fact that he wanted Saving Private Ryan to have that very distinct shutter look that it had, they could have made that decision not only beforehand, as they did, but with the Lytro camera after the fact.
That's exactly right. So you could have switched to, in that case, about a 90 degree shutter angle to make that nice hard strobe, very gritty look. Or he could have intercut multiple different aesthetic looks if you wanted to jump to that, and then a different moment where you wanted to have the more motion blur and more of that dreamlike state, which is what we did in this particular shot. One additional thing that we'd like to highlight very quickly is the ability to take all of your CG assets and render them as a 4D light field. But the idea is that you're actually getting now the full planoptic 4D light field, which allows you then to do the final composite in 4D. So with this, now that you can see, if you can note here that this is now a 4D light field, see all the little lenslets that is actually identical to the structure that's created optically within the camera. That is all part of the plugins that we provide inside of Nuke or inside of whatever the 3D software is. So just going into here, and you're able to see that now I can refocus on this shot where you have the background all in focus now, or because it is a 4D element, I'm able to defocus that. I can also, and this is just kind of a little geeky note here, let's say I throw this entire scene out of focus completely. Let's now go and actually change the lens parameters. So right now I have 12 blades to my actual aperture. Let's say I want to do a 3-bladed aperture, not to say you want to do this, but as I zoom in here, you see you actually have a triangular aperture in terms of the bokeh of the scene. And then I can also then change that to be anamorphic if I want. So this is the wedding sequence, which is a extraordinarily challenging scene. And it may not look challenging when you're looking at this final composite, but it is the result of multiple plates, multiple light field capture, and a lot of CG renders that are integrated into this one final resulting image. And this is the final sequence as it was composited. What you're seeing is this is actually live action confetti that was depth screened from one take of the actual film, and then it was recomposited over a second take. You also then have a light field silhouette plate, you have a virtual matte painting for the environment, and then you have this set extension here, which is basically virtual grass and a virtual lifeline. That's part of the story that was told in this project. So showing how this was actually accomplished, with the light field, you're actually able to generate an automated 3D camera track of the world, and it provides you with subpixel accuracy of that virtual position. So what you're looking at here is the original plate that was captured. And we like to show this because it is quite literally one of the worst things that you could ever do for your scene. So the director and cinematographer, Robert and David, had a lot of fun that they choreographed the grips to walk behind the set. The camera is literally just moving on bare concrete, so you see that it is highly unstable. And then they actually surprised us with a confetti bomb, which the guy who's launching it is in the top right here. He's actually in the frame. He launches a confetti bomb, and if you were to use this with any other camera tracker or any other types of algorithms, they just fail. If you look in this representation here, you see these little red crosshatches. This is showing you just some of the features that are being tracked in the scene automatically. And it's giving you this down here on the bottom left, the actual camera that's being computed. Fundamentally, the one thing to take out of this is that what we're able to do is extract out the exact position of the camera as it travels in space and over time. Now, once you have that camera information, then it is a rather easy task to perform the depth screen and then recomposite. So this is live action confetti. The first take is on the left, the second take is on the right. So what they wanted to do with the scene is take the element from the confetti and place it on top of the better performance on the non-confetti take. So when you watch what we're able to do, you perform that depth extraction, you overlay it back on top of the second scene. And then because you have the camera as it was tracked in time and space, you can reproject both into the real world so that they are locked into the actual coordinate that they were captured. If you didn't have that, you would have two completely different motions that would not actually composite well at all. From here, we can actually also then show what we're able to do for rotoscope. So in this scene, realistically, we use this on the feet because the feet from a depth key standpoint are touching the actual ground. So you still need to separate that from the ground itself. But we like to show this here that even with the confetti, the artist goes in, they lay down a spline on the first frame or whatever frame that they select, and then you can automatically track that over time as well. From this, you're able to see how we're able to create the depth key, the depth extraction. This is the estimation process. We then extract out the couple. That is then placed on its own projection path with its own camera track. You have a separate camera track for all of the confetti. You also have a separate camera for the silhouettes that are then integrated into the shot. You then finally have a completely new virtual camera that has all of its own intrinsic properties, and that allows you to re-photograph the scene and complete the final composite. And this is how the final composite looks when you place everything back together. So the one element that we like to show here is the fact that everything you see here is actually a full light field element. So even though you have the set extension for the grass layer, even though you have this virtual painting for the background, when you actually composite, you're using your same merge nodes, the same operations that you would for a traditional 2D composite, but you're working with the actual 4D light field. You can then also completely stabilize your camera. So if you look at the original take that you see here, I'm going to just kind of fly through a couple of frames. You can see clearly the camera is not moving in a very smooth path. It's all over the place. You can see it kind of, right? What you now can do here, however, is create a completely new camera path and reproject your rays of light through the lens and optically stabilize your scene. So when I say optically, that is a true optical stabilization, as if your camera was smooth at the time of capture, as opposed to making a 2D tracking point or whatever you're doing for corner pinning.
When you would introduce motion blur, artifacting, you'd still be able to tell that you had stabilized it on a traditional camera.
That's correct. That's correct. So on a traditional camera, when you do that, you would actually have baked in incorrect parallax. So here you're able to see that you are just moving the camera on Z now, and you're creating essentially a completely virtualized camera. It is not just any one component, it's an entire ecosystem. So it comes with the camera, it also comes with the back-end server architecture to allow you to stream the data, in addition to process and store. We also showed on Tuesday our entire cloud ecosystem. We're working in collaboration with both Google and the Foundry in order to make that a reality. And the thing that the cloud allows you to do is, because we're working with such large data sets, you can upload the raw files, you can then process, you can interact with, because we have the software running actually on the cloud compute environment, and then not have to transfer the data back and forth between multiple facilities.
When you say large data files, what are we talking here?
Well, it is a 755 megapixel sensor. So depending on bit depth, depending on frame rate, each frame when compressed is in the 650 megabyte range. So you have, for every one output pixel, literally hundreds of input pixels. So that's something that we like to highlight as the main advantage of the technology, is that you have so much additional metadata about your scene. You can do things for visual effects and for the actual composition that are previously just not possible to do after the fact.
And you said you're working with Google and Foundry. Is this something that editors and compositors, they have to go out and learn an entirely new piece of software, or are you working with existing software platforms?
That's a fantastic question, because that's the third thing that the system comes with is actually plugins to existing industry standard software applications. The first launch partner that we are working with is actually Nuke, and in the future we'll refine that API to integrate into additional software applications. With the light field, you're actually able to take the content and then re-render it to optimize for any distribution outlet or format. So if you want to do a high frame rate cinema release, you can do that and then re-render it in a separate way for either broadcast, which has a very different frame rate, or you can then re-render it for stereoscopic, depending on if it's IMAX or RealD, or really anything and everything in between. But the idea of having a full 4D composite allows you to have the ultimate light field master. So this is something that is quite unique to light field, that we also provide the tools to take all your visual effects assets, convert them into a light field, final your composite, and then that way, if you want to make a decision change or a distribution change, you don't have to go back through post and visual effects.
Right now you have 100 millimeters of the ability to move it, and it seems like with virtual reality and video game applications, there's no limit to how much you could potentially change things as the technology progresses. What is Lytro's take on that?
So for the Lytro Cinema technology, it's all about the camera's field of view, and it's all about making sure that the decision that was made at the time of capture is as optimal for the edit or for the scene as possible. But everything that Lytro does is all about capturing the volume of the world. So we also have the Lytro Emerge technology, which is a very different hardware design. And that's all about that immersive 360-degree experience. In order to do that, you have a very different optical construct. And our take on that is that we want to exist in this volumetric space. We want to capture the volume. We want to be able to move around that volume seamlessly. So the idea here is that as we start to refine and work with industry experts on this technology, we may find that we start using multiple of these cameras for every single shot on a film. We've already had a lot of requests for even for Lytro Cinema, can they put that with 10 of these in a big radial array and capture the full volume in 360? And absolutely, we can globally trigger the entire system simultaneously. And it's the same thing for Lytro Emerge. You could have a whole bunch of these units all around a room and capture that full environment.
Is the idea to eventually democratize this and make this more available to independent filmmakers and to filmmakers of all levels throughout?
Yes. Our goal ultimately is to have light field imaging become the industry standard for capture, but there's a long journey to get there. So right now, this is the first generation. Like any first generation technology that's truly on the bleeding edge of what's possible, it is a larger camera. But that allows us to capture all of those rays of light, And as we move forward, we're already working towards the design that becomes a completely handheld, battery-operated, and untethered system.
So it's just like computers where they started off as the size of a room, and now you have an iPhone and it's more powerful in your pocket.
That's exactly right. The ultimate goal is to have it be the same form factor that you would be accustomed to for cinema production. And that's something that we're already actively working towards. It is a very complex development, but it is something that will happen sooner than later. So it is really unlocking a potential that when you start having this become the same form factor as a traditional camera is really giving so much more control that it will make the actual final product that much better.
Well, I will let our viewers at No Film School decide whether they've seen the future of cinematography, but thank you so much for explaining and showing us the Lytro Cinema system.
My pleasure. Thank you again.